Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. I'm always grateful to see Tech.eu doing a conference in London. It's very much an event where you get all sorts of interesting people in the room. Obviously, TechCrunch is a global media outlet. You know, I'm sure you know about what this is. I just want to do a little bit of an intro, although you have heard their names. I'm just going to do a teensy bit of an intro because I think it's just worth sort of talking about who's in the room. In my order, up there, starting at the end, Sinead O'Sullivan now is a space and defense economist. She's led MIT's research on emerging technology, national security and defense. Her background is in aerospace engineering at NASA, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the US Air Force, and the US Navy. And she is a board member of the European Space Policy Institute. Alex Flamant, next to me, is partner at HCVC, doing hard tech investing. And I'd like to know what the difference with what hard tech is versus deep tech versus every other tech. We'll hear that in a minute. You can tell me in a second. And then finally, next to him is Samuel Burrell, who's partner at Expeditions Fund and a former Royal Marines officer. So, round of applause for our panel, please, ladies and gentlemen. Now, let's set the stage. Now, normally when we all go to these tech conferences, you know, you hear about people talking about B2B SaaS, and of course these days, always it's about AI, and it's all very nice, and somebody's trying to invent another platform so we can file our expenses more efficiently. But you know, we are in a different world now. It is 2025. We are several years into Russia's brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine, and on the border of Europe, we have a geopolitical situation where America appears to want to move away. We've had group chats on Signal between the US cabinet talking about firing missiles all over the place and slightly being rather rude about Europe, I thought. I don't know about you. So there seems to be a very interesting opportunity here. And that's why I suggested to Ada and to Tech.eu that we do a panel on defense tech. But let's get our definitions right, because obviously what's going to happen over the next few years is that the whole technology industry is going to reorient in some way, even if not all of it, but certainly quite a large amount of it, into the defense tech space. And people don't know how to engage. So, Sinead, perhaps if we can start with you first. What are your definitions? And I'm not asking you to come up with all of the answers right now, but what's the best way, especially for a generalist audience, to start thinking about this subject these days?
Yeah, we'll get the whiteboard out. I'm probably the last person you should ask about this because I'm not an investor, unlike these two next to me. So if you're an investor having definitions...
You do advise investors.
No, I'm very much involved in the investing world. But when I think about it from the lens of the hat of an economist, I actually find that although it's very useful for investors to be like, this is hard versus deep versus defense tech, I think about it more loosely in terms of, and one of the easiest ways to think about it is, what is a defense prime? And I think this is a really useful starting point because, you know, a lot of people think, well, a prime is a large company that will interact, you know, most of its contracting through government sources.
So what's an example of that?
Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman.
These are the people who build fighter jets.
BAE Systems, and many other things. When we think about today, what is a prime? You know, a prime is essentially a company that exerts enormous geopolitical power, essentially. Now, we think about the contracting, but definitely you can actually think about the power that it's exerting too. So when we think about the future of defense and where this is moving to, and you know, essentially what the technology in the future is going to look like, what is the future of primes? And I think, you know, that is moving towards some sort of hard and software-based tech, and it's really essentially thinking about what is the geopolitical, you know, technology that's going to shape the world order, you know, in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time. And I think that that prime definition is a lot looser than what you're going to hear from the investors who have an investment mandate against a certain set of technologies. But it's going to be very different to what it was in the past. And I think we're going to start to see biological technologies be involved in that. Certainly software is becoming a huge part of integrating a lot of that stuff. We're going to talk about drones and F-35s and whatnot. But from my perspective as an economist thinking about where the defense future is, I think about like what is the changing shape of a prime, because the technologies that exert massive and enormous geopolitical power are going to be very unlike the ones that we've seen in the past. It's not just fighter jets.
I think so. It's quite interesting. You're starting almost at the top of the stack. You know, who buys all this stuff. Alex, what are your thoughts?
I think just on that note, there's also not just who buys it, but how you buy it. When we think of F-35s, destroyers, aircraft carriers, the prime in this case is effectively just taking their time plus cost of materials and adding a premium on it, say 20% or whatever, versus very different to how you buy an iPhone, which is we're going to mass produce these and then you can buy them off the shelf. And when you think of where technology is headed, and we look at Ukraine, it's maybe less few extremely expensive goods that if you lose them, you're going to have a terrible day, to mass-produced, attritable drones or other technologies where actually companies like Burrell are going, I'm going to produce these, I'm going to give you the cost. If you buy them, great. But they're not going through this 10-year program where by the time you've released a product, it might be obsolete. So the primes are adapting, but I think it also leaves room for a lot of earlier stage companies who maybe don't want to focus on 150 million euros a pop type goods and have these more, I can produce 1,000 of these out of Poland a month and engage in contracts. So that the how you buy it is also as interesting, I think, than who you sell it.
Well, that's a sort of a different kind of a model to the tech startup model that many of us are familiar with when they're effectively selling to businesses that want a new kind of API that works with a corporate or whatever it is, or business process orientation or whatever. So Samuel, I went to Defense Tech Hackathon and I met all these military people the other day, and I said the future of defense is small, cheap, and uncrewed. In other words, there isn't any humans sort of flying the thing around, and that's a very different world from the sort of traditional sort of defense space. But how can startups get involved in that world in your view?
It's a good question. So at Expeditions, we think that defense tech writ large is at an inflection point at the moment in terms of the development of the technology. So this is a comparison that you might have heard before, but if you think of the first ever aeroplane, was not a great aeroplane. It was developed by the Wright brothers and it flew a few hundred meters and couldn't really turn. And that's kind of where we feel we are with autonomy at the moment, right? So autonomous drones, autonomous surface vessels, autonomous subsurface vessels haven't existed before this point because the technology was never there. So we didn't have the AI that powered the autonomy that powers these unmanned vessels. That's changed. The way that founders can get involved is to start developing those types of autonomy that are going to be programmed into those devices in a world that in 5 to 8 years' time is going to completely change the battlefield. So what we see now is humans moving around on the battlefield. They're being intercepted by semi-autonomous assets. In the future, we see fully autonomous assets moving against fully autonomous assets. And that's the direction of travel at the moment.
I mean, does it end up being just robot wars and, robots killing each other rather than human beings? I mean, maybe that's not such a bad thing, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, the way we think of it is that there will be large parts of a battlefield that will have robots v robots. And then there will be areas where there's human existence and, greater electronic warfare to stop those robots coming in. And that's what the humans have to exist in these smaller bubbles, but for large parts of the battlefield, they're going to be. But
zooming out, I mean, there's an awful lot of other technologies that back up all this stuff that's at the kind of the coalface, for want of a better phrase, right at the front line, I suppose. And you have Anduril in the US, which is a very large defense technology company from Palmer Luckey, who famously invented a lot of VR. And in Europe, we've got Helsing, which is another kind of very large, very well-funded, to the tunes of maybe a couple of billion at this point, or certainly valuation, doing battlefield AI and drones, goodness knows what. But there's other kinds of things that can be involved, like cloud computing. Europe is clearly going to start looking at resilience in cloud computing and its possible independence from United States platforms. And there's all sorts of other things that need to be invented and created, Sinead, isn't there? And the investors that you talk to must be thinking, well, you know, we're not going to magic an Anduril or a Helsing out of thin air right now, but there must be lots of very interesting startups, you know, around the edges.
Yeah, so one of the things I've spent a lot of time doing in Europe is looking at the aerospace-based defense strategy across the economic region. And it really is a matter of figuring out for Europe where Europe is best poised to play and where it wants to play and what it ultimately needs to access in the face of the threat of war. And Europe has always traditionally been very good at downstream technologies, right? So like in the space sector, for example, we don't have launch systems that can compete with SpaceX, but we do have an unbelievably good network of downstream business activities and economies that are reliant on upstream technology. Now I think what Europe is fundamentally trying to understand is, can it, and I think it does want to move upstream very quickly, are we able to create the launch systems, the missile defense systems upstream, and then downstream, how can we benefit from that by creating, as you said, like this kind of network of technologies around that? And it's an interesting question because, you know, part of that, as we're seeing, you know, everyone's seeing at the minute, is how do we finance some of this? A more fundamental question, and I'd be interested to hear what you guys are seeing here, is do we have the talent that, you know, money aside, where are the engineers coming from that can do this? Because I've spent a lot of time in Europe over the last year actually going, meeting and talking to people, engineers, young engineers that have touched, physically touched. I mean, a question here, but like, has anyone actually touched any space or defense hardware in this room?
What do you mean, like missiles or something?
Anything.
Has
anyone actually touched, physically touched? Yeah,
I've seen the drone now and again.
So like, this is one of the problems that Europe has at the minute, that like the young engineers coming out of US universities have all built shit long before they go work at SpaceX.
Right.
So they have launched to 30,000 feet missiles and rockets.
Playing around with things that go up in the sky a lot.
Absolutely. In Europe, we don't have that. So there's this massive gap. Okay, we're going to create bonds that are going to finance a lot of this, but what about the people? And this is where you guys are probably seeing what's happening.
It's a great point because we invest, HCVC invests across the US and Europe, and you know we love founders who've gone to Caltech, MIT, gone through JPL, but I think the hidden universities of the US where we're seeing the next batch of industrial defense entrepreneurs is SpaceX, it's Tesla, it's Anduril, and the alumni, just like we had the PayPal mafia, are coming out of these companies having worked on Starship for 5 years. And they have real world expertise on how, not just how do you launch a rocket, but how do you do so at scale, understanding manufacturing processes. And in Europe, we kind of had that 10, 15 years ago when some of the ad tech companies IPO'd. That was tech 15 years ago, right? It was all about ad tech in Europe. And then we got Dataiku, Algolia, and a series of other companies. But that same equivalent, and made harder by the fact that Europeans can't work at SpaceX. You need to be an American citizen to launch rockets.
But here, I'm just going to push back on that because I hear this all the time, and it really irks me. I'm on the board of the MIT Rocket Launch Group, student group, right? It's a student-run organization. Now, they have thousands of dollars in funding every year, tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're really, really well funded. If you go to the universities in Europe, there is no self-organization around this for many different reasons. The students are really keen to do it, but like there are European problems with this, right? So like you try and find a place in Europe where you can launch a rocket. There's just, they will not
It's
allow you to do that.
It's likely to land on some archaeological site. This is the problem.
But for Sam, you're in Poland. I mean, the vibe has to be different there, I'm sure.
Yeah. So just to slightly change the angle of thought on that. So Mike, you asked about where we get the talent from. A question I like to address is where we get the money from. So, and it goes back to your first question, which is what is dual use? So I'd like to give you a definition and then a little bit of why this is important.
Okay, well, so dual use might be the way into the sort of the gateway drug or the Trojan horse or whatever you want to call it into defence space. What's your dual use being something that can be used on the battlefield and also in civilian space.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the opportunity. Go ahead.
So dual use. So the way that we think about dual use as early stage investors is something that can be used, can be bought by government and also commercial civilian organisations, but also something that at the moment is bought by government and in the future may be bought by civilian commercial organisations. So that's an important distinction for us, because if you're an early stage company, maybe you just have one customer and you're focusing on delivering to that customer. And why is that important? Well, limited partner agreements, so the way that venture capitalists get their money from their investors, often have these, at the moment, have a lot of structure in them around exclusions. So what types of industries are you not allowed to invest in? And typically, those have excluded dual-use companies and defense companies. And in the US, you have less of that. So at the moment, there's a kind of sea change in Europe and underway as to changing those LPAs, allowing venture capitalists to invest in harder technology, like Alex does. But it's a real sticking point at the moment. And for many funds who just agreed with their investors around what they're allowed to invest in, maybe last year or 2 years ago, they won't be able to change those agreements for the next 6 to 8 years. So it's something to consider.
But this is why you're reading in the Financial Times that defense is now sustainable, because these LPA agreements, are like, well, you have to be sustainable. It's like, well, guess what? We're going to pretend that defense is now sustainability.
Yes, I even saw a startup the other day. It was decarbonising defence, which is, I thought, an interesting one. Well, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have a very long panel, but in the closing couple of minutes, it would be nice to get some takeaways from you guys for the audience about if you're not in the defence tech space or dual use, or what sort of advice would you give to people, entrepreneurs, investors, engineers, looking at the space, who are not in the space at the moment and don't have connections, which I think many people don't right now. We're just really at the foothills of this. What advice how would you get involved? Go to some conference, connect with you guys. Where do we find this stuff? Because actually, even me, not as an insider in this space, has started to realize that there's a whole world out there that I'm not really aware of. How do we get involved in it?
I guess, kind of going back to the point you were making, this one's more for the founders out there, but selling in defense is very hard. You're selling to MODs, the parts are a little bit more expensive. It's kind of the double black diamond of selling and building. I would say go and work somewhere where you get to build things, you get to touch them, you get to work on something really hard for someone else perhaps, and then consider joining a defense startup, a prime, starting your own. But I never like to give the advice that go and get a real job first, but this might be the one industry where it probably makes sense. And there's a ton of really interesting European companies that are hiring today across the UK, Poland, France, Greece. So, catch Mike, catch one of us after, and we'd be happy to point you in the right direction.
Simon.
For the investors out there, there is about to be a buying frenzy in Europe of defense technology. If you're not invested in defense tech, you should be. go and find some companies to invest.
Well, the EU just announced a huge 150 billion euro fund, which the UK is not part of, unfortunately,
Yeah.
but that's another matter.
You're missing out.
We're missing out. Sinead?
Yeah, I think whether you're, actually maybe, especially if you're an investor looking to get into the space, go and build something. You literally have to figure out how to build something. And what we're seeing in New Zealand when they started moving into aerospace defense is that they took all the shipbuilders and the composite engineers and moved them into building reusable rockets very, very quickly. In Europe, you have great Formula One, you have great, very varied types of engineering that are happening already. Just literally go and build something. Understand that process. Understand how engineers work if you're going to be an investor. Engineers are, really, especially in this space, very strange creatures. Understand what makes them tick and get involved hands-on in a very physical way.
Yes. Well, Europe has traditionally been pretty good at turning swords into plowshares, and now it's time to turn plowshares into swords, alas. But it's going to be a big opportunity for people in tech. So to Sinead O'Sullivan, Alex Flamant, and Samuel Burrell, and from me, Mike Butcher, from TechCrunch, thank you very much and have a good conference.